Tonight we explore the tragic story of Amanda Williams, a beloved hairstylist, mother and grandmother, whose life was cut short in the most shocking way imaginable. What began as an ordinary night inside her Warrensville Heights home ended in unimaginable violence. By the time the chaos subsided, Amanda Williams was lying motionless on the floor, struck by multiple gunshots, and the man she trusted most was claiming it was all in self-defense. Amanda Williams was more than just a name in the news. She was a vibrant woman, known in her Ohio community for her gift as a hairstylist and for the warmth she extended to friends, family, and clients alike. Her loved ones describe her as the glue of the family, a mentor to many, and a grandmother who brought light to every room she entered. But behind the closed doors of her home, her relationship with her fiancé, Tirrell Edwards, would descend into conflict that would leave her family shattered forever. On the night of October 10, 2023, police dispatchers received a chilling call. Tirrell Edwards told authorities that he had just shot Amanda Williams. His voice carried a mix of panic and justification. When officers arrived, they found Amanda critically injured. She had been shot again and again, 6 times in total, with wounds that struck her neck, her chest, and her back. The brutality of the attack left no doubt that this was not a single shot in fear, but a relentless act of violence. Edwards would later claim that Amanda had come at him with a knife during an argument, forcing him to grab her gun from under their mattress and fire rapidly to save his own life. He painted himself as the victim, saying he had no choice but to shoot. But investigators and forensic experts quickly discovered troubling inconsistencies. One of the bullets had severed Amanda's spinal cord, which doctors confirmed would have paralyzed her instantly. Yet Edwards insisted she continued to attack him even after that wound. The physical evidence and his words did not align. What followed was a storm of grief, anger, and outrage. At first, Edwards walked free, with authorities saying they lacked enough evidence to hold him. Amanda's family and community were devastated, crying out for justice. Weeks later, a grand jury indicted Edwards on charges including murder, felonious assault, and domestic violence. His courtroom battle would expose not only his shifting stories, but also the pain endured by a family robbed of their matriarch. In this episode, we will unravel the heartbreaking truth behind the Amanda Williams case. We will explore the timeline of events, the disturbing details revealed in court, and the way her family fought for her voice when she could no longer speak for herself. And most importantly, we will reflect on what her story means for the ongoing fight against domestic violence. If you find value in these stories and believe they must be told, we encourage you to like this video. Leave your thoughts in the comments, subscribe to our channel, and join the discussion. Your voice helps keep these stories alive. Amanda Williams was not just another face in the crowd. She was a woman of strength, a woman of faith, and a woman who built her life around her family and her career. Born and raised in Ohio, Amanda dedicated her life to her craft as a hairstylist. For years, she poured her energy into making others feel beautiful, building friendships with clients who often said sitting in her chair felt like therapy. She carried herself with dignity, always smiling, always willing to lend a hand, and always making time for her children and grandchildren. Those who knew Amanda best describe her as the cornerstone of her family. She had raised her children with care, and as they grew into adulthood, she remained their anchor, guiding them with advice, encouragement, and unconditional love. Her grandchildren were her joy. She spoiled them, not with material things, but with time and attention. Amanda Williams was the type of woman who filled a room with laughter, who cooked Sunday dinners, and who never let anyone she loved feel alone. But behind the warmth she gave to others, there were struggles within her private life. Amanda had been in a long-term relationship with a man named Tirrell Edwards. At first he was charming, attentive, and seemed like a partner who supported her dreams. But over time, cracks began to appear. Arguments became more frequent, disagreements turned into shouting matches, and what had once been love began to look more like control. Amanda's family had their concerns, but Amanda, like so many women in similar situations, tried to hold on to hope that things would get better. On October 10, 2023, those concerns became a chilling reality. That night, Amanda and Tirrell became engaged in yet another heated argument inside their home in Warrensville Heights. The exact details of the argument remain unclear, but what is known is that within minutes it escalated beyond words. According to Edwards, Amanda armed herself with a knife, threatening his safety. He claimed he had no choice but to act. Reaching under the mattress, he retrieved her firearm. Instead of retreating or calling for help, he pulled the trigger. One shot would have been enough to stop any threat, but Edwards fired 6 times. Each bullet tore through Amanda's body with devastating effect. One struck her chest, another her neck, another her back, and one bullet severed her spinal cord, a wound doctors later testified would have left her unable to move. And yet, even after that, Edwards kept firing. When the gun fell silent, Amanda Williams lay lifeless in her own home. A woman who had given so much love, so much care, was gone. Her family would never hear her laughter again. Her clients would never sit in her chair again, and her grandchildren would never again feel the comfort of her arms. This was not just the loss of a life, it was the tearing apart of a family, the silencing of a mother's voice, and the shattering of a community. In the moments after Amanda Williams took her final breath, the house fell into a haunting silence. The only sound was that of Tirrell Edwards, frantically dialing 911. His voice, steady yet strained, carried a chilling calm as he told dispatchers what had happened. He claimed Amanda had attacked him, that she came at him with a knife and that he had been forced to defend himself. To the operator, it sounded like a man reporting a tragic accident, but to those who would later learn the truth, it was the beginning of a calculated story. When officers arrived at the home in Warrensville Heights, they were met with a disturbing scene. Amanda lay motionless, her body riddled with bullets. 6 shots had torn through her, one through her chest, one through her neck, one through her back, and another that shattered her spinal cord. Investigators would later note the sheer force of violence, questioning why so many shots had been fired, if this was truly a case of self-defense. Still, in that moment, Edwards insisted on his version of events. He told police Amanda had been the aggressor, that she had armed herself with a knife, and that he had no other option but to shoot. Shockingly, law enforcement allowed Edwards to walk free that night. Claiming they needed more time to investigate, police released him, while Amanda's family was left to pick up the pieces of their unimaginable loss. For Amanda's loved ones, the decision was devastating. How could the man who pulled the trigger 6 times, the man who admitted to shooting their mother, their sister, their grandmother, simply walk away? Her children were outraged. Her friends were furious. And within days, her community joined in that outrage. Vigils were held in her honor, candles lit for the woman who had given so much light to others. People demanded answers, demanding to know why a man who admitted to the killing had not been placed in custody. Social media filled with posts honoring Amanda's life, but also condemning the system that allowed her accused killer to go free, even for a short time. As the investigation continued, prosecutors dug deeper. The trajectory of the bullets told its own story, one of rage, not survival. Experts explained that a single defensive shot may have been believable, but 6 shots, many to critical areas of the body, were far beyond what self-defense required. They described the bullet that severed Amanda's spinal cord, explaining how it would have rendered her incapable of movement. Even after that devastating injury, Edwards kept firing. It became harder and harder to reconcile his claims with the evidence. What kind of self-defense requires shooting a woman 6 times, even after she is already incapacitated? What kind of fear justifies such overwhelming force? The pieces didn't fit, and the community refused to accept his explanation. Amanda's family spoke publicly, their voices heavy with grief. They remembered her not as a victim, but as a vibrant woman whose life had been stolen. They demanded justice, and slowly their cries began to gain traction. The case that began with Edwards walking free was far from over. The truth was beginning to close in, and with it, the question of whether Amanda Williams' killer would finally face the consequences of his actions. Months after Amanda Williams was laid to rest, the case that once seemed uncertain finally moved forward. Authorities charged Tirrell Edwards with murder, a decision that brought a measure of relief to Amanda's grieving family. But their relief was mixed with fear. Fear that the same system which had allowed him to walk free after her death might somehow allow him to walk free again. Inside the courtroom, the tension was heavy. On one side sat Amanda's family, dressed in black, clutching photographs of the woman they loved. On the other side sat Edwards, quiet, his eyes fixed on the table before him. He maintained his plea of not guilty, still insisting he acted in self-defense. The prosecution began their case with the crime scene photographs. Each image painted a chilling story: Amanda's body lying lifeless, blood pooling around her, and 6 bullet wounds piercing her flesh. Jurors were shown the autopsy report. 1 bullet had entered her chest, another had torn through her neck, and one, perhaps the most devastating, had severed her spinal cord. The medical examiner explained that after that spinal injury, Amanda would have been unable to move, much less pose any kind of threat. Yet Edwards kept shooting. The prosecutors argued that this was not self-defense, but execution. They told the jury Amanda had been defenseless, and that the sheer number of shots revealed Edwards' intent. "Ladies and gentlemen," they said, "this was not a man protecting himself. This was a man eliminating a woman who no longer served his control." Edwards' defense team painted a different picture. They claimed Amanda had come at him with a knife during a heated argument, and in that moment he feared for his life. They urged the jury to see him not as a killer, but as a man caught in a desperate struggle. But the evidence worked against him. Investigators revealed no fingerprints from Amanda on the knife he claimed she wielded. Experts testified that the weapon had been staged, placed deliberately to bolster Edwards' story. Even more damning was the fact that many of the shots had been fired from a distance, not in the close-quarters struggle he described. Amanda's children took the stand, their voices shaking as they recalled the abuse their mother had endured. They spoke of arguments, of controlling behavior, of moments where Amanda confided in them about her fear. Their words gave jurors a glimpse of the pattern. This was not an isolated act, but the culmination of years of tension and control. The trial stretched on, each day filled with raw testimony and conflicting accounts. When it came time for the jury to deliberate, the courtroom fell into silence. Hours passed before the foreperson rose to deliver the verdict. "Guilty," the jury declared. "Guilty of murder in the death of Amanda Williams." Gasps filled the room. Amanda's family wept, clinging to one another, knowing that justice, though delayed, had finally been served. Edwards, once free to walk the streets after taking her life, now faced the weight of accountability. The courtroom doors closed that day, but the echoes of Amanda's story carried far beyond those walls. When the word guilty echoed across the courtroom, it carried a finality that no one could mistake. Amanda Williams's family clutched one another, tears streaming down their faces. For months, they had sat in silence, reliving the horror of her death through every photograph, every testimony, and every memory. And now, at last, the system had spoken, but there was still one final step: sentencing. In the days that followed, both sides prepared for the hearing that would decide Edwards' fate. The prosecution urged the judge to consider the brutality of Amanda's death. They reminded the court of the 6 shots, the spinal injury that left her paralyzed, and the continued firing even when she could no longer fight back. They argued that this was not a crime of passion, nor a split-second mistake. It was cold, deliberate, and final. Amanda's children and grandchildren stood before the court during the victim impact statements. Their words painted a portrait of a woman who was more than just a name in a headline. They spoke of the countless nights she stayed up braiding hair to support her family, of the laughter she brought into every room, and of the wisdom she passed down with patience and love. One daughter's voice broke as she said, "My mother begged for her life, and instead of mercy, she was silenced. We will never hear her voice again." Edward sat motionless as they spoke, his face unreadable. His attorneys pleaded for leniency, insisting that his actions had been clouded by fear and poor judgment. But the weight of the evidence, and the weight of Amanda's absence, was too much to overlook. When the judge finally returned with the sentence, the room braced for impact. The words were clear, steady, and without hesitation: life in prison. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Amanda's family cried openly, not out of joy, but out of relief. For them, justice could never restore what was lost, but it was a necessary step toward healing. Edwards was led away in handcuffs, his head bowed, the life he once lived now over. Outside the courthouse, the community gathered. Amanda's case had touched a nerve, not just because of the brutality of her death, but because of the silence that often surrounds domestic abuse. Neighbors, church members, and fellow hairstylists spoke out, urging others not to ignore the warning signs that Amanda herself had once tried to hide. Local organizations used Amanda's story to spark conversations about domestic violence prevention. Her name became a symbol, a reminder that behind every statistic was a mother, a grandmother, a friend. Schools, churches, and community centers held vigils in her honor, each candle lit, representing a plea for change. Though justice had been delivered, Amanda Williams' story did not end in that courtroom. It lived on in the determination of her family to speak out, in the strength of survivors who came forward after hearing her name, and in the call for society to take domestic violence seriously before another life is cut short. Amanda was gone, but her memory had become a force no one could silence. The clang of the prison doors closing behind Edwards marked more than just the end of a trial. It was the end of his freedom, the collapse of a man who had once stood behind a badge, now reduced to inmate number 46721. Inside those cold grey walls, Edwards faded into obscurity, another lifer swallowed by the system. But outside, the world was only beginning to wrestle with the scars he left behind. For Amanda's family, the weeks after sentencing were heavy with grief. They returned to a home filled with her pictures, her perfume lingering faintly on old clothes, her laughter echoing only in memory. At family gatherings, her empty chair was impossible to ignore. Her grandchildren, too young to understand the full weight of what had happened, asked innocent but heartbreaking questions. When is Grandma coming back? Questions no one could answer without breaking down. Yet amid the sorrow, there was resilience. Amanda's daughters formed a small support group for families affected by domestic violence. What began as 3 women meeting in a church basement soon grew into dozens of survivors sharing stories they had once been too afraid to tell. They found strength in Amanda's memory, believing that if her story could save even one woman from suffering the same fate, then her death would not be in vain. The community, too, rallied. Local news stations ran specials on domestic violence awareness, using Amanda's case as a stark warning. Churches organized candlelight vigils, each flame a symbol of both mourning and resistance. Her name was printed on banners, her face on flyers. Amanda Williams had become a rallying cry. Schools began inviting counselors to talk to young people about recognizing toxic relationships before they escalated into violence. Local lawmakers, pressured by the public, revisited policies on restraining orders and firearm access for individuals with a history of abuse. Amanda's tragedy, though devastating, forced conversations that had been buried for too long. Meanwhile, Edwards remained behind bars, his name forgotten by most except those who remembered the trial. Reports from the prison painted him as withdrawn, a man who spoke little and kept to himself. There were no visitors, no family to come and sit across from him on visiting days. In the silence of his cell, he faced the reality of what he had done, not just the murder, but the betrayal of the community he had once sworn to protect. But while his life diminished, Amanda's legacy grew stronger. Each year on the anniversary of her death, the family held a memorial walk. Hundreds joined, wearing shirts that read, "Justice for Amanda, justice for all." Survivors marched alongside them, holding signs that carried their own stories of survival and pain. Amanda Williams was more than a victim. She became a voice for the voiceless. Her life, though cut short, ignited a movement that refused to fade. And in that, she lived on. Not in silence, not in fear, but in the courage of those who stood up and said, "Never again." Time moved forward, but for Amanda's family it never healed in a straight line. Every holiday, every birthday, every family milestone carried with it a silent reminder of her absence. The smallest things, a favorite recipe, an old voicemail, the sound of a song she loved, would reopen wounds that never truly closed. Grief became a companion, one they learned to live with but never escape. Her daughters, however, refused to let that grief consume them. They continued to build Amanda's legacy into something larger than her tragedy. They established a foundation in her name, dedicated to supporting survivors of domestic violence. What started as local workshops quickly expanded into statewide programs. They partnered with shelters, offered legal aid, and even funded safe houses for women in crisis. To the world, Amanda was no longer just a victim. She was a symbol of protection for countless others who needed a voice. The impact of Amanda's story spread far beyond her community. Journalists revisited her case in documentaries, exposing the red flags that were ignored and the systemic failures that allowed Edwards to hide his violent tendencies for so long. Advocacy groups pointed to her murder when lobbying for stricter laws, demanding that background checks, restraining orders, and domestic abuse records be taken more seriously. Politicians who once sidestepped these issues could no longer look away. Amanda's name had become too powerful, too symbolic to ignore. Inside prison walls, Edwards aged in silence. The once commanding officer was now a shadow of himself, swallowed by a system he once enforced. Fellow inmates viewed him with contempt, many labeling him a coward who turned on his own family. There were whispers of altercations, reports of nights where he sat in his cell staring blankly at the wall. For all his power and control on the outside, here he had none. His downfall was total, and yet it was Amanda's story, not his, that endured. Each year, her family's memorial walks grew larger. Survivors carried signs with messages like, "I am here because she wasn't, and Amanda's story saved me." People who had never met her, men, women, even teenagers, marched in her honor, their steps echoing through city streets. Candlelight vigils spread across multiple towns as strangers lit flames for a woman whose courage had awakened them all. Her grandchildren, as they grew older, came to understand not just the tragedy, but the strength their grandmother left behind. They heard stories of her kindness, her laughter, her determination to keep her family together. They carried her memory proudly, determined that she would never be reduced to just a victim in the pages of a crime report. And so, Amanda Williams's story lived on, not in silence, not in fear, but in action. In laws rewritten, in lives saved, in voices empowered, she became the face of change, the spark that lit a fire against domestic violence. In the end, Amanda's legacy proved stronger than Edward's crime. Though he sat rotting behind bars, her name grew louder with every passing year. She was gone, yes, but in truth, she had become immortal. As the years rolled on, Amanda's case remained etched in the public conscience. For many, she became more than just another statistic in the long list of domestic violence homicides. She became a turning point. In town meetings, lawmakers, educators, and activists repeatedly invoked her name, as if speaking it out loud was both a warning and a promise that her death would not be in vain. Amanda's daughters took the lead in making sure of that. They didn't just grieve, they fought. They lobbied tirelessly for stricter policies on restraining orders, demanding that law enforcement be required to act more decisively when warning signs of abuse were present. They pushed for better training for officers handling domestic violence calls, ensuring victims were treated with the urgency their situations demanded. They spoke at conferences, met with senators, and appeared on national broadcasts. What had once been their mother's private tragedy became their public mission. The weight of her story even reached schools. Educators began integrating lessons on healthy relationships, red flags of abuse, and resources available for students. Amanda's name was often mentioned in assemblies. Her story used to teach teenagers that silence could be deadly. Survivors who had never felt brave enough to speak suddenly found themselves reaching out, writing letters, joining support groups, or sharing their stories in Amanda's honor. Meanwhile, Edward's existence inside prison continued to unravel. With each passing year, he grew weaker, more forgotten. Inmates who had once feared him as a former officer now mocked him for what he had done. For many behind bars, harming children or betraying family was the ultimate stain, one that stripped him of any respect. His health declined, and in the silence of his cell, he was left to face the one thing he had tried to control his whole life: his own guilt. Yet outside those prison walls, Amanda's voice seemed louder than ever. Candlelight vigils stretched across multiple cities, thousands of tiny flames flickering in the dark, each one a life touched by her story. At one vigil, her daughter read a powerful statement. "My mother's light was stolen by violence, but tonight you can see, it burns brighter than ever." The crowd fell into silence, many reduced to tears. Documentaries revisited her case, often framing it as a chilling reminder of how easily manipulation, charm, and unchecked power can conceal a predator. Investigative podcasts dissected every detail, drawing in millions of listeners. Some called Amanda's case a mirror for society, forcing people to confront how often signs of abuse were dismissed until it was too late. Her grandchildren carried her memory like an inheritance. They grew up hearing not just about her death, but about her warmth, her laughter, and her resilience. They didn't allow her story to end with bloodshed. Instead, they transformed it into a source of pride, a constant reminder of why their family continued to fight for others. And so, Amanda Ass Williams' story lived on, not frozen in tragedy, but moving forward in change. She became the voice behind laws rewritten, the silent protector of women she never met, the face that reminded society of its duty to protect its most vulnerable. In the end, Edwards' crime was swallowed by history, but Amanda's name only grew louder. She had been silenced in life, but in death she became unstoppable. Time has a way of dulling headlines, of replacing yesterday's tragedies with today's chaos. But Amanda's story refused to fade into obscurity. A decade after her murder, her name was still being spoken in town halls, classrooms, and courtrooms across the country. She had become more than a victim. She had become a symbol, a cautionary tale, and, above all, a catalyst for reform. Her daughters, now older and seasoned advocates, carried her legacy like a banner. They often admitted that grief never really left them. It only reshaped itself into purpose. In interviews, they described moments when they would hear their mother's favorite songs playing in stores or dream about her voice calling their names. Those moments hurt, but they also fueled them to push harder, to ensure that no other family had to carry the same wound. Their campaigns led to the creation of Amanda's Law, legislation that tightened protocols around restraining orders and mandated immediate follow-ups by law enforcement when victims reported threats. Communities embraced the law. Shelters received increased funding, hotlines were staffed around the clock, and awareness campaigns blanketed neighborhoods that had once ignored the whispers of abuse. For many survivors, Amanda's face became the image of hope, a reminder that speaking up could lead to change, even if it came too late for her. Meanwhile, the man who had tried to erase her from existence, Edwards, was decaying in the silence of his prison cell. He had entered as a figure once respected, even feared, a former officer, a man who once wore the badge of authority. But inside, all illusions crumbled. Other inmates despised him, not only for the betrayal of his role, but for the cruelty of his crime. His once proud demeanor withered into isolation,